member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today in support of the motion that's being put forth by my honourable colleague from Sault Ste. Marie on precarious employment. I certainly enjoy working with him on the industry committee. I know he brings a depth of experience to everything he does, and really thank him for bringing this forward for us to talk about in the House and hopefully to take forward towards committee work. And the committee work that's done for the House of Commons by members of all parties and by the witnesses that come from across Canada to share their expertise are critical in us developing good policy in Canada. So I really don't want to undersell the advantage that we have as members of Parliament to use our committees to good use to give us the input we need to come up with good regulations and good laws. As I begin, I'd like to share the story of one of my constituents. A constituent of mine, Karen, is a personal support worker in Guelph. Personal support workers care for the elderly, for the disabled, for sick persons in their homes by providing services such as bathing and dressing, and even just being there for conversation. Karen can work up to 70 to 80 hours in a week. She works full-time hours, but she's classified as part-time. In her own words, she takes care of sick people, but doesn't have a sick day. Karen has no pension and her benefits are not guaranteed. She says, because my employer says I'm part-time, I have to requalify for benefits every year by working at least 1,500 hours. She said, last year her friend, another precarious worker, found out that she had cancer. She missed a lot of work because she was so sick, and then she lost her benefits. Mr. Speaker, Karen's story isn't unusual. She's paid $15 an hour during her time with clients, but she's not paid for her travel time, and she can't afford a car, so she often rides the bus 30 to 45 minutes between appointments. She has no guaranteed hours in a week, and she has no job security. Karen is indeed a precarious worker. Precarious employment is a non-standard work that lacks stability, security, and control. It can be part-time or it can be temporary, and it's underprotected by regulation. This emerging trend is the reason this motion has found its way to the floor of the House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, this motion could direct the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities to undertake a study on precarious employment. The emergence of precarious workers is a result of a rapidly changing marketplace. The standard employment relationship, the term for permanent, full-time, secure employment with a single employer, is still the most common form of a job. The proportions of standard employment relationships, though, are dropping. However, as Karen's story tells us, norms do not reflect everyone's reality. The rise in precarious employment is concerning for a number of economic and political reasons. It reflects a growing inequality in Canada, and it contributes to racial and gender divisions in our society. Most worker advocates talk about the economic unfairness of precarious employment and the problems it creates in the labour market and in communities. Precarious employment is also a health and safety issue, as has been discussed in other speeches in the House today. The status of being a precarious worker leads to worsened health and safety outcomes. Precarious workers earn less, and they're less likely to have benefits, or may have fewer benefits than other workers. Women, immigrants, and young workers are more likely to hold precarious jobs than other Canadians. That leads to unequal access to some of our health care, such as medication or such as counseling services that are available to other Canadians. The status of being a precarious worker leads to worsened health and safety outcomes overall. At work, repeated studies with different types of precarious workers have shown that they're also more likely to be injured. For example, hotel cleaners who work for a temp agency. Most will be women who are paid low wages and have little job security or control over their schedules. Their work will be physically demanding, and if they're unwell, they're reluctant to call in sick for fear of not being hired again. But that's not to disparage temp agencies. As an employer myself of small business, I didn't have an HR department to help to screen candidates. I didn't have an HR department to help to do the pre-training required in order to meet the conditions of my employment. Using temp agencies gave me access to labor markets that I wouldn't have had on my own, apart from calling friends and neighbors that I might have known knew people that might be available for work. So temp agencies do have their place, Mr. Speaker, but we have to look at the impact on workers chronically going through short-term contracts, never getting to full employment, never getting towards benefits, and never getting towards the security they need mentally and physically to be able to fulfill their lives in Canada. Some studies suggest that jobs that demand a lot of effort but provide workers with little control over their work and little support can damage workers' health via stress. Currently, little to no work has been done to determine how to reduce the ill effects of precarious work, in large part because precarious work is just becoming recognized as a health and safety hazard. So, Mr. Speaker, to confront a problem like precarious employment, we first need to know more details. This is where the member from Sault Ste. Marie's motion can play a very meaningful role. By attaching definition and by identifying the indicators of precarious employment, we can understand the cause and effect so that we can provide recommendations to reverse this trend in the labour market. We can also hear from Canadians with lived experience, Canadians that otherwise might not have a voice to come forward. But the motion goes further in part 2. It stresses the need to identify the role that precarious employment plays in the economy, and particularly within the federally regulated private sector, to understand the impact it has on the lives of individual Canadians. Something like we studied in the Indu Committee about how do we get more diversity on boards, how do we get better representation of all Canadians in the governance of companies. This study would say, how can we get all Canadians participating in the labour force? That the nature of work and the employment relationship can affect workers' health is a new concept. It requires us to rethink what constitutes a hazard and how hazards can cause health consequences, including how they interact with non-work aspects of the workers' lives. It also causes us to contemplate new ways of controlling these types of hazards. One surefire way to reduce the health effects of precarity is to create jobs that are more secure and to support workers more fully. This solution requires broad-scale social, political, and economic change. I'd also argue it has to be environmentally sustainable. As my speech draws to a close, I encourage all my colleagues in this House to support the motion that's before us today. The labour market is changing. We need to understand how and where gaps are forming as a result of these changes in the market. Mr. Speaker, the first step to solving a problem is recognizing that there is one. Canada's labour markets are changing, and government policy needs to change with them. This review will help provide insight into the current changing situation and recommendations on how to manage this emerging problem, and for more detailed debate in this House. Thank you again to my honourable colleague from Sault Ste. Marie for bringing forward this debate and for all that he does to serve his community and Canadians. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.